I got a text from the HOA that was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Your cabin's instability triggered the rockslide. You're liable for the destruction of 12 homes. They thought they could pin the blame on me, the guy in the little self-built cabin perched on the edge of their fancy development. They figured I'd be an easy target, someone they could steamroll with their lawyers and insurance companies. But they had no clue who they were dealing with. I'm a retired geological engineer, and I had a 4-inch binder stuffed with evidence that would expose their catastrophic negligence. They started a war they were destined to lose, and it was going to be a spectacle. Here's how it all unfolded. If you love watching entitled HOAs get their comeuppance, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the fallout from this one. Let me take you back so you can see just how arrogant these folks were. I'm Dan, and for 40 years my life revolved around rocks. Not in a metaphorical way, I was a geological engineer. I worked on everything from skyscraper foundations to tunnel boring projects. I knew better than most that the ground beneath us is alive. It shifts, it moves, and it doesn't take kindly to fools. When I retired, all I wanted was peace. I saved up enough to snag a beautiful, secluded 10-acre plot in the mountains, a place I'd dreamed about for years. My vision was simple. Build a small, sturdy cabin with my own 2 hands, where the only sounds would be the wind in the pines and the crackle of a fire. The first year was all about studying the land. I took core samples, mapped the bedrock, and analyzed historical water tables. My future cabin wasn't just going to be a structure. It was going to be part of the mountain, anchored to its strongest point. I designed it to be efficient, sustainable, and, most importantly, stable. The foundation was over-engineered, pinned directly to a massive granite shelf I'd discovered. My drainage systems were meticulous, channeling water away from the structure to prevent soil erosion. It was my masterpiece, not of luxury, but of longevity. For 5 years, it was paradise. Then the bulldozers rolled in. A developer bought the 300 acres below my property, and within a year, the estates at Summit Ridge popped up. It was the definition of gaudy. 12 sprawling, cookie-cutter mansions, each trying to outdo the last with unnecessary turrets, 3-story foyers, and infinity pools that seemed to hang over the valley. The new residents were exactly who you'd expect. Folks driving cars worth more than my entire cabin, loudly discussing stock portfolios and quarterly earnings. They were city people bringing all the worst habits of the city with them. And with them came the Homeowners Association. From the moment the first moving van arrived, the HOA, led by a woman I'll call Brenda, made it their mission to sanitize the mountainside. Brenda was the archetype of an HOA president. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a perpetually pursed-lipped expression, and a golf cart she used to patrol the neighborhood like a warden. My property wasn't technically part of their HOA, which drove her absolutely nuts. But that didn't stop her from trying to exert her imaginary authority. The first letter I got was a courtesy notice, suggesting my rustic, split-rail fence made from timber on my own property didn't meet their community aesthetic standards. The next letter complained about the color of my metal roof, which was a natural, unpainted gray. Apparently, it needed to be an approved earthen brown. Then came the complaints about my unkept landscape, which was literally the natural forest floor I had preserved. I politely replied each time, reminding them that my property was outside their jurisdiction. Their responses grew increasingly condescending, dripping with a thinly veiled classism that suggested a guy in a small cabin couldn't possibly grasp the high standards of luxury living. They saw my simple life as a blight on their million-dollar views, and they were determined to make me feel unwelcome. It wasn't just their attitude that irked me. It was their houses. From my vantage point, I could see the entire development, and my trained eye spotted things that made my blood run cold. They'd carved massive, flat pads for each home by cutting into the base of a steep, concave hillside, a classic recipe for slope failure. The retaining walls looked decorative, not structural. And their water management? Total joke. I could see where they diverted natural drainage channels, forcing runoff to pool and saturate the soil right above their new cuts. It was textbook bad engineering, the kind of stuff they teach in a first-year university course titled, How to Create a Landslide. I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to let them reap what they'd sown. They'd been nothing but hostile and condescending. But my conscience wouldn't let me stay silent. People could get hurt. So I decided to take the high road. I drafted a formal letter to the entire HOA board, identifying myself as a retired geological engineer with 4 decades of experience. I calmly outlined my observations: the undercutting of the slope, the inadequate retaining walls, the improper water diversion. I even offered to share my extensive geological survey data, free of charge, which clearly showed the historical instability of that hillside. I ended the letter by strongly recommending they hire an independent geotechnical firm for a thorough stability analysis. I sent it via certified mail. 2 weeks later, I got a response that felt like a slap in the face. It was a letter from Brenda, arrogantly dismissive. She thanked me for my amateur concerns, but assured me their development was handled by a nationally recognized, fully certified team of professionals. The letter dripped with condescension, implying my expertise was quaint and outdated compared to their modern methods. The final paragraph was a thinly veiled threat. We advise you to focus on bringing your own property up to community standards rather than casting aspersions on a development that has significantly increased the value of this entire area. They weren't just ignoring my warning. They were mocking me for it. They saw me as a jealous old man in a shack, envious of their wealth. And it didn't stop there. After my letter, the HOA's harassment campaign kicked into high gear. They sent me official-looking violation notices, citing county codes they had no authority to enforce. They tried to fine me $500 because my gravel driveway wasn't paved. They complained that my woodpile was an eyesore. They even demanded I remove a dead pine tree 100 yards from their nearest property line, claiming it was a fire hazard. It was a clear, coordinated effort to bully me, to punish me for daring to question their glorious development. That was the moment everything changed. I went from being a concerned neighbor to a man preparing for war. They had shown their hand. They would never listen to reason. When the inevitable happened, they wouldn't take responsibility. They'd look for someone to blame. And I knew, without a doubt, they'd point their fingers straight up the hill at me. That's when I knew I had to get ready. I started building my arsenal of truth. My 4-inch binder was born. I became obsessed with documenting their negligence. Every morning, I'd walk the perimeter of my property with a high-resolution camera, taking time-stamped pictures. I captured the hairline cracks appearing in their main retaining wall. I documented the water pooling against the foundations of the homes after even a light rain. I photographed the small soil slips and erosion channels forming all over the butchered hillside. I dusted off some of my old professional equipment. After every rainfall, I'd take soil saturation measurements along the public access road below their development, creating a detailed log. The numbers told a chilling story. The ground was becoming increasingly waterlogged, losing its cohesive strength with each passing storm. Then I went to the county records office. I pulled the public files for the entire estates at Summit Ridge project. What I found was damning. The geological survey their developer submitted was a sham. It was a best-case scenario report that conveniently glossed over the hillside's history of instability. Crucial data points about soil composition and groundwater levels were missing. It was optimized to get a permit, not to ensure safety. But the real smoking gun? An old county survey from the 1970s explicitly designated that exact parcel of land as a high-risk landslide zone and recommended against any significant development. Their developer had either buried this report or committed such gross negligence by not finding it that it bordered on criminal. I printed everything: the fraudulent survey, the old county warning, my photos, my soil data, copies of my warning letter and their dismissive response, every bogus violation notice they'd ever sent me. I organized it all, tabbed it, and placed it into the binder. It was a meticulous, undeniable chronicle of their arrogance and incompetence. A fortress of facts, just waiting for the day I'd need it. And I didn't have to wait long. The storm that triggered it all wasn't a hurricane or some once-in-a-century event. It was just a week of steady, relentless autumn rain. The kind of rain the mountain was used to, but the butchered hillside could no longer handle. On the 5th night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a loud crack of thunder or a sudden crash. It was a deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. A sound of immense pressure and slow, sickening failure. I rushed to my window, the one overlooking the valley. The rain was pouring down, but through the darkness, I could see a horrifying spectacle. The entire hillside beneath the estates at Summit Ridge was moving. It wasn't a fast, sudden rockslide like you see in movies. It was a slow, terrifying, liquid-like slump. Trees were tilting at impossible angles. The decorative retaining wall I'd been watching crumbled like a child's sandcastle. And then, with a deep, resonant shudder that I felt in my chest even from half a mile away, a massive section of the hill gave way. I stood there, stunned, as the earth beneath those 12 mansions simply liquefied. One house, the one with the precariously perched infinity pool, tilted forward and then collapsed in on itself. Another was torn in half, its two sides sliding away from each other. The lights in the entire development went out. The sound of twisting metal, splintering wood, and shattering glass echoed across the valley, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the falling rain. My cabin, anchored to solid granite, didn't even shudder. It stood exactly where it always had, a silent witness on stable ground. The next morning was chaos. Sirens wailed endlessly. Helicopters buzzed overhead. The main road was blocked with emergency vehicles. And that's when my phone buzzed. It was the text from Brenda, the one I mentioned earlier. Your cabin's instability triggered the rockslide. You are being held liable for the destruction of 12 homes. I read it, and instead of anger or fear, I felt a cold, calm certainty. They were doing exactly what I predicted. They were trying to frame the narrative from the very first moment. They were trying to make me the villain. The media, hungry for a simple story, jumped on it. The local news ran with the headline, "Rustic Cabin Eyed as Trigger for Luxury Home Disaster." They interviewed a tearful Brenda, who spoke tragically about the unregulated construction on the hill above them and the reclusive property owner, who had refused to cooperate with the community. I was painted as the reckless hillbilly whose selfish project had destroyed the lives and dreams of 12 families. The HOA went a step further, hiring a private security firm to block the public road leading toward the slide zone. They claimed it was a safety measure, but I knew the real reason. They were trying to keep me away, to prevent me from documenting the truth of what had happened, to control the scene and the narrative. They treated me like a criminal. 2 weeks later, they made their big move. The HOA called an emergency town hall meeting at the local community center. They invited all the displaced homeowners, their insurance adjusters, city planning representatives, and the media. The agenda was clear: to publicly present their evidence against me and formally announce the massive lawsuit they were filing. This was meant to be my public execution. I showed up, of course. I walked in wearing a simple jacket and carrying my 4-inch binder. The moment I stepped through the door, the room fell silent. Every eye was on me. Brenda, standing at a podium on the stage, looked like she'd seen a ghost. She immediately hissed at a security guard, "Get him out of here." The guard approached me, but I didn't budge. I spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried through the silent room. "This is a public meeting regarding a matter that directly concerns my property. I have a legal right to be here. If you attempt to remove me, it will only add a charge of harassment to the lawsuit I will inevitably be filing against you." The guard hesitated, looked at a panicked Brenda, and then backed away. I took a seat in the back and waited. For the next hour, I listened as Brenda and the HOA's lawyer put on a masterclass in deflection and misinformation. They showed aerial photos that cleverly framed my cabin as looming menacingly over the destroyed homes. They talked about my unpermitted structures and my refusal to cooperate. Brenda gave a tear-filled speech about the loss of their beautiful community, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at me and called me a menace whose negligence had shattered their lives. When she finished, and the room was filled with a mix of sorrow and anger directed at me, I stood up. "I'd like to say a few words," I announced. Brenda immediately tried to shut me down. "We are not interested in hearing your excuses." But a man in the front row, one of the homeowners, shouted, "Let him speak." I want to hear what he has to say." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Their lives were ruined, and they were starting to realize they'd only heard one side of the story. I walked to the front of the room, placed my binder on the table with a solid thud, and opened it. "My name is Dan," I began, my voice steady. "And for 40 years before I retired to my cabin, I was a senior geological engineer. I've overseen the construction of projects on terrain 10 times more challenging than Summit Ridge. The ground doesn't lie, and this binder is its testimony." I started methodically, page by page. I projected the first document onto the screen behind me. "This is a letter I sent to your HOA board via certified mail 1 year ago." I read aloud my warning about the undercut slope and the poor drainage. Then I projected their response. The one calling my concerns amateur and telling me to mind my own business. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Next, I put up the photos. These are time-stamped photographs of the main retaining wall, showing the progression of cracks over the last 8 months. I clicked through a dozen images, the cracks growing wider and wider. "This isn't instability from above. This is failure from within." I showed them my soil saturation data, explaining in simple terms how their construction had created a waterlogged time bomb. The insurance adjusters in the room were now scribbling furiously. Then came the hammer blow. "This," I said, projecting a scanned document, "is the geological survey your developer submitted to the county. And this," I said, putting a second document beside it, "is the official county geological survey from 1975. The homeowners leaned forward. "Your developer's survey conveniently omits any mention of historical instability. But the official county record, a public document they either criminally buried or were grossly negligent in not finding, designates this exact hillside as a severe landslide hazard and a no-build zone." Chaos erupted. The homeowners were on their feet, shouting. Not at me, but at Brenda and the HOA lawyer. The city officials looked horrified, realizing the scale of the oversight and fraud that had occurred on their watch. Brenda stood at the podium, her face ashen, her jaw slack. She was speechless. I closed my binder. "Your homes weren't destroyed by my little cabin," I said, my voice ringing with clarity. "They were destroyed by greed, arrogance, and a catastrophic refusal to listen to the truth. You didn't build on a foundation of rock. You built on a foundation of lies." The legal fallout that followed the town hall meeting wasn't a battle. It was a demolition. My binder became the blueprint for a massive class action lawsuit filed by the 12 families. But their targets weren't me. They were the developer, the engineering firm that faked the survey, and most satisfyingly of all, every single member of the HOA board personally. The developer's parent company declared bankruptcy. The engineering firm was disgraced and suspended. But for Brenda and her board, it was a special kind of karmic justice. The court found them guilty of gross negligence and fraud, which meant the legal shield they thought protected them was shattered. These people, who built their entire identities on their wealth, suddenly had their assets frozen, their luxury cars repossessed, and their wages garnished for the foreseeable future. The very luxury they used to look down on me for not having was stripped away from them, piece by painful piece. The estates at Summit Ridge is now a ghost development. The name has been wiped off local maps, and the land was condemned by the county. Where 12 mansions once stood, there are only crumbling concrete scars that the forest is slowly, patiently covering over. The mountain is taking back what was stolen from it. Sometimes, I walk to the edge of my property and just look down at the quiet, green monument to their hubris. I did end up filing my own lawsuit against Brenda and the HOA for defamation and harassment. I won a significant settlement, but I couldn't stand the thought of keeping a single dollar of their tainted money. So, I donated the entire amount to a regional environmental conservancy, a group dedicated to protecting mountains like this one from the exact kind of people who tried to ruin it. My peace was finally restored. It's ironic, isn't it? They saw my little cabin as a threat to their pristine community. In the end, my cabin, built on a foundation of respect for the land, is the only thing left standing. It turns out that listening to the mountain is far more important than keeping up with the Joneses, especially when the Joneses build their house on a lie. This whole ordeal taught me that when you're up against people blinded by greed and ego, the best weapon isn't shouting louder. It's the cold, hard, undeniable truth. And a well-organized, 4-inch binder doesn't hurt, either. You might think that was my last run-in with a power-tripping HOA, but you'd be wrong. A few years later, in a totally different place, I found myself dealing with a board that believed they had the right to tell me what I could and couldn't grow in my own vegetable garden. They had no idea I'm also a master gardener with a passion for malicious compliance. That story involves petty tyrants, weaponized botany, and an ending you won't see coming. But that's a tale for the next video.